Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, climate change is reshaping the Sahel. Food insecurity, coups and the pandemic are leading to a rise in violence and terrorism. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced as a lake in Mali evaporates. What little water there is controlled by armed groups, including Al-Qaeda. But armed groups are making a grab for gold-rich land in the region. And drought has ravaged the California Central Valley. The region provides vast amounts of food for the US and for export. But for how much longer? 100 private and state-owned fossil fuel companies account for almost 80% of historical greenhouse gas emissions. The richest, most developed and industrialized countries are overwhelmingly to blame for our climate emergency. But they're unlikely to suffer the most from it. It's areas like the Sahel in Africa that are suffering the most. An explosive cocktail of climate change, food insecurity, coups and the pandemic are leading to a rise in violence and terrorism. Known as the Belt of Africa, the Sahel is a 5,000-kilometre semi-arid territory which stretches from Mauritania on the Atlantic Ocean to Eritrea on the Red Sea. But these are the countries in the West African Sahel that we're going to be focusing on today: Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali and Niger. Now, out of 189 countries on the UN's Human Development Index that looks at income, health and education to assess how well economies are doing, these nations rank at the bottom of the table. And here's what's contributing to the poor economic performance. Temperatures are rising 1.5 times faster than the global average, and could be 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer by 2050. Remember, the Paris Accord hoped to keep global warming well below 2%. All this is leading to erratic rainfall. The United Nations estimates that 80% of the Sahel's rain-fed farmland is affected by degradation, which is undermining food production. COVID has pushed the Sahel region into its deepest recession since independence. Some 1.3 million people have been plunged into extreme poverty, with 1.4 million young people poised to enter the Sahelian country's job markets every year with little in the way of opportunity. It's proving to be recruiting ground for extremists. Well, extremists who've been financing themselves through taxes on farmers and trade routes through the Sahara have made a land grab for gold-rich areas in the tri-state area in North Burkina Faso, which is Africa's 4th biggest producer of gold. A Reuters investigation found that terror groups were tapping the $2 billion informal gold trade in Mali and Niger. Well, outside intervention has done little to quell the violence. 8 years after deploying troops to the Sahel to crush a jihadist insurgency, France has said that it plans to halve its presence. That decision didn't go down well in Mali. Interim Prime Minister Choguel Maïga slammed France for its abandonment of Mali. It's now seeking support from Russia. OK, we have 2 reports for you. In a moment, Al Jazeera's Ahmed Idris reports from Chad on the consequences of shrinking fertile grazing lands. But first, Al Jazeera's Nicholas Huck on how climate change has transformed a lake in northern Mali into a desert.
On the edge of Timbuktu is a disappearing lake, with the temperatures approaching 50 degrees Celsius. Vanished into thin air are the green waters of the mighty Lake Figibin. Mamadou Usman says it's getting hotter. He's no longer a fisherman. He's witnessed waves of sand gradually take over the waterways he once sailed for fish. The seashells from a life that once existed remain. Gone are the mango trees and the green gardens for farming, mourns Usman.
When there was water on our land, we grew rice and wheat. Look at it now. The people of the village are building natural barriers to stabilize the sand dunes and stop them from moving. Already the sand is dangerously close to their homes.
From above, the natural barriers looks like a fishing net cast over the sand, an attempt to stop the unstoppable desert. Dunes have already buried homes. Now it's headed for the nearby school.
You see, this sand dune wasn't there before. It entered the school from the right. The ground was flat between those 2 blocks. This is a school for almost 400 students. That's an entire generation, a lost generation, a generation condemned to flee or be recruited.
More droughts, fewer rainfall. Water has become scarce. Farmers and herders fight over it in areas where the Malian state is largely absent. Armed groups including Al-Qaeda control access to water and arable land, giving it only to those willing to join their ranks.
The combination of the armed conflict and the effect of climate change is like a death sentence for those populations. When the wells are empty, people have to flee in search of that water, and there are places where people fight for water. It's a source of conflict between communities today.
300,000 people have fled an area where there was once an abundance of water. The surface of what was once Lake Fakabine is hot with an unknown gas, and it's killing the remaining shrubs, forcing the last people to leave this vanishing oasis in search of a more friendly climate.
Another victim of climate change, a prized horse, succumbs to the searing heat. Here, an exhausted lamb was left behind by a migrating herd for wild animals to devour. As his losses pile up, Ado Muhammad rounds up his cattle and family and head towards the border with Cameroon.
We are leaving to where the pasture's greener and the weather's more bearable. The migration will save what's left of my cattle. The drought and the rising heat have taken so much away from me.
He's just trying to cut his losses and recover, even if that means risking attacks by bandits, Boko Haram, and corrupt officials as he crosses the Chad-Cameroon border. Mohammed Jibrin expects the dry period and his losses to continue.
The rains have failed us, and the unbearable heat is drying up the little water that we have. It's painful to watch your animals die, and there's nothing you can do about it.
He's not sure if he will have any cattle left before the rains return. Activists say people in the Sahel are already living the gloomy future. They say the region continues to see rising temperatures and fear it could get worse.
I can definitely tell you that in this region, time has in fact run out. It's up to us to act and mitigate the impact.
Armed groups still occupy large swathes of territory, further limiting access to water and land for agriculture.
As the impact of climate change becomes clear, pastoralists are forced to make a difficult decision: to sell off their animals at very low prices or let them die. And when they bring them to markets like this, they find few people can afford to buy them. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, N'Djamena.
Let's get some analysis with Ornella Moderan, the head of the Sahel program at the Institute for Security Studies. She joins us via Skype from Bamako, the capital city of Mali. Good to have you with us, Ornella. How much of what we've just seen is to do with climate change, and how much of it has to do with poor economic management and political instability?
All of these factors definitely play into this dire situation. On the one hand, climate change is compounding very difficult situations in terms of, desertification, extreme climate events that are affecting the livelihoods and the lifestyles of already very fragile communities. However, as you rightly mentioned, the poor economic and political governance of several parts of the region only make things worse. The fact that, government instability has been plaguing Mali, or that a very serious security crisis has been raging on in the region for nearly 10 years now, only make things worse.
And Ornella, what is behind the rise of the armed groups? Is it lazy of us just to apply the labels extremist or Islamist to these groups?
This is a very good question, because extremist really depends on where you stand, right? In the Sahel, what we see is a variety of armed groups with a variety of operating modes and demands. On the one hand, you have those groups that are labeled terrorist or violent extremists, which tend to be pushing an Islamic reference point. However, at the same time, you have a whole series of local armed groups that don't have any particularly religious or political demands, and that rather operate around issues of local violence, local violence and local conflict. So actually, it is a simplification to look at the security situation as being exclusively a violent extremist driven one.
And does outside intervention help? France is currently drawing down troops after 8 years in the region. Is it fair to say that they've had little impact on the violence?
Well, we don't have the counterfactuals, so we don't know what things would be looking like by now if the French intervention, if the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali, if, various European training missions and so on had not been on the ground. What we do know is that despite this extremely considerable expenditure, both in terms of, political investment, financial investment, and lost lives also, the situation remains critically dire, which definitely shows the limits of the international and external interventionism.
And Mali, where you are, is now looking to Russia for support. Is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, I think that's something that should, first of all, concern and question the traditional military and security partners of Mali. The very fact that the Malian government has been waiving the prospect of dealing with not just Russia as a country, but a Russian private military company at what would be an extremely high financial cost, while at the same time you do have international bilateral and multilateral partnerships that are extensive and that are for free. This should question international partners in terms of the efficacy of their support, as well as in terms of its alignment to Malian needs and priorities. At the same time, of course, it's important to keep in mind that the Malian government has still not confirmed anything about this so-called Russian private military company deal, and this remains a key element in what, at the end, is still very much a political game and a diplomatic battle.
Ornella, how are the armed groups operating in the region financed? And what is their hold right now over the gold-producing areas?
This is another great question. So the armed groups operating in the region are funded through both internal and possibly external financial flows as well. One thing we know is that, the recourse to illegal taxing using the zakat, for instance, as well as ransoning on the roads, as well as cattle rustling or contribution and involvement in illegal gold mining are part of the local funding streams that these groups operate on. We also do have data on the presence and the use of supply chains, including through West African coastal states, which these groups are using to get access to material goods and to financial flows from outside the region.
Al-Qaeda-linked groups have held talks with authorities in Mali and Burkina Faso. Have those talks gone anywhere? Have they been productive?
This is a work in progress. So Sahel states have for a long time, well, at least I should say Mali and Burkina have both for a long time had a bit of an unclear position on whether or not to initiate dialogue with groups labeled as violent extremists. In Mali, the situation has started evolving around 2017 with a series of national talks that actually prompted the government to explore this option, while this is something that started being discussed much more recently in Burkina. It's likely that these talks would, at least that the option for such dialogue would remain on the table, but key questions that governments will have to solve include, well, what is there to be discussed? Who exactly are the interlocutors? What are the communication channels to be used? And frankly, I mean, if you're going to initiate negotiations, you should also be willing to consider what you want versus what you're willing to leave on the table. So what is the room for negotiation and potentially bargaining here?
Ornella, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, 80% of our food is grown on 500 million small farms around the world. Just a 1 degree increase in global temperatures would hit production by 10%. As we've already seen, climate change is having huge consequences in the Sahel. It's also a problem in the rich world. Here's Al Jazeera's Rob Reynolds with a report from California.
So how are things going?
It's tough.
Mike Wood is a third-generation farmer in California's San Joaquin Valley. He grows 200 hectares of almond trees. But recently, he's been thinking of selling the ranch.
Yeah, the consideration of sale has been right in the front of the gray matter for quite some time, actually.
This valley is a cornucopia of agricultural plenty. Rich soil and a benign climate produced a vast bounty of meat, milk, vegetables, fruits, and nuts. But global warming is changing the valley.
2021 was the second driest year on record.
While some years are wetter than others, repeated drought strains the capacity of an elaborate system of canals and reservoirs that bring water from far away. It's getting hotter, too. The valley hit a record 45 degrees Celsius in September.
Land where fruits or vegetables might be grown would be left idle.
It's not unusual to see sites like this, entire orchards ripped up and ground into mulch. These effects aren't unique to California.
China, Russia, Nigeria, Brazil, all over the world have their own localized impacts. But the one thing in common is that global warming is causing those impacts, and humans are causing global warming.
Scientists say some of the world's most important breadbasket regions are also the most at risk of failure due to climate shocks.
Persistent drought and extreme temperatures here in California and other farming regions around the world raise an important question about the future of our species. How can an ever-warming planet feed a human population that is expected to grow from 7.9 billion today to nearly 10 billion by mid-century?
Simply expanding farmland won't do. The more forests are cut down, the worse global warming gets. Scientists say we must adapt or starve.
Our ability to be able to feed the planet is going to require some wholesale changes, both in how we produce food and how we share food across the planet. It's going to require that we probably change our diet and move more towards a plant-based diet.
This is the emitter.
Mike Wood is optimistic that technology will provide a solution.
When I talk about the technology, I'm talking about the ability to produce 50% to 100% more than we did on the same acre 40 years ago.
Hope for the future in a time of climate uncertainty.
Let's get more then on the challenges that farmers face as they deal with climate change. Michael Gidney is the Chief Executive of the Fairtrade Foundation. He joins us now via Skype from London. Good to have you with us, Michael. Tell us something about the impact then that climate change is having on the farmers that you work with.
Well, Fairtrade is a global coalition of farmers, businesses and consumers working to get a better deal for the men and women in lower income countries who grow the food that we all rely on every day. And the problem is that climate change is real and it's happening now. We work with 1.8 million farmers in 75 countries around the world, and it's their number one priority. So the challenge we face is the positive noises, the words that have been pledged in COP need to be translated into action immediately. Let me just give you one example of the many we're seeing from around the world amongst fair trade producers. In the Dominican Republic, where farmers grow bananas for export to the European markets, there were enormous problems with flooding caused by the climate crisis. Entire banana farms were flooded in 2016, wiping out the entire crop. And then the following year, there were hurricanes. Just after they'd replanted, hurricanes again wiped out the crops. Now, for farming communities who rely on being able to grow food to export, that's an incredibly serious problem. And for us as consumers, it really matters, because just in the UK, for example, bananas are a food staple. They're in pretty much every child's lunchbox. And so if we collectively don't tackle the climate crisis, there will be no bananas. The humanitarian cost will be devastating for the growing communities. But for us, and it's part of our food security in the global north, it really matters to us.
Rich nations had pledged, something like $100 billion in annual finance to low-income countries affected by the climate emergency, and they've largely failed to live up to that promise. Are you any more hopeful now after COP26?
Not yet, I'm afraid. That's the short answer. The pledges are still there, but the money isn't. And there are two problems with the money, and this is why we in Fairtrade are campaigning for this $100 billion promise to be met. The promise was made years ago, and it still hasn't arrived, and it needs to be $100 billion every year to help lower income countries in the global south adapt and mitigate against climate change. And like I said, just with my example on bananas, it's happening today. The pledges have still not made that 100 billion, come to life. There are various pledges, but the number is way below the 100 billion. Now they're saying they may start next year, it may be the year after. I think 2023 is the latest I've heard. The problem is it's also that even when the money is pledged, even if it's found, it then needs to be put into the hands of the people on the front line. And in many agricultural countries, those are the farmers themselves. Too often, the money doesn't actually get into their hands, and they need it so they can invest in what's needed on their farms to be able to mitigate against the climate crisis.
All right, so what are the companies that you work with doing to help the farmers, to provide the support that they need?
Well, I think Fairtrade is an example of hope, actually. So, as I said, we are a coalition of farmers, consumers, campaigners, and businesses. And we're all involved in COP this year. There is a pledge which 27 leading companies around the world have signed, which says that they will stand by farmers as part of the way they think about mitigating their own carbon footprint. I mean, the logic is, if you're investing in food, if you're in the food business, you have to recognize that farmers need a fair income. It all begins with price and poverty, I'm afraid. So unless farmers have the financial wherewithal, the working capital to invest in mitigating on their farms, they will not be able to withstand the climate crisis. So the leading businesses that we work with, global brands like Ben & Jerry's, we also work with very many of the retailers around the world, in the UK, the Co-op, Waitrose, Sainsbury's, and so on. They are committed to seeing, if you like, a holistic approach where in order to mitigate their own carbon impacts, they have to recognize the weakest financially in the chain. Too many times that's farmers. So what they're saying is they see paying the farmers a fair price as a very important first step of ensuring that there is working capital and investment in those farms. And of course, with that, what happens is Fairtrade producers, they're experts. They know what they're doing. They're also entrepreneurs. They're not passive beneficiaries in this. So they are using the extra capital that comes through Fairtrade to invest in their businesses, better irrigation, better soil management. They're setting aside areas of land for nurseries so they can grow climate-resistant crops. They're looking at afforestation as well as reforestation, a load of enterprising activities, which would be really an important part of the problem. So there is hope, but that just needs to be taken to a very big scale, which is why the $100 billion a year from the global governments is needed now.
Michael, many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost. Really good to talk to you.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Don't forget, if you want to comment on anything that you've seen, you can tweet me. I'm at @Finnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you can drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. There is plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.